There we go. That's the right screen. Greetings, gamers, and welcome to the 66th live stream from the Misfit Gamer Studios. I'm your host, Vortex, and this is D&D Discussions. On today's episode, I'm going to be bringing you pretty much the first installment of my Do's and Don'ts series. It's a new series that I want to kind of bring on when I don't have Kage here in the studio with me. So the first step that we're going to do today is going to be onboarding new players. And it's going to kind of be a mix of Do's and Don'ts, but for the most part, I'm going to be focusing on Don'ts. There's specifically 10 don'ts that I want to kind of hone in on in things that, from my own experience as a DM and experience as a player, these are things that I most have often seen and have also been victim of or have perpetrated myself. Things that I have done that I now recognize were not the best way to do things. So these are going to be essentially, 10 things of advice that I would suggest you don't do with new players and bringing them onto a new campaign, bringing them into a new party group, etc. Basically, and this is just kind of a way to, better integrate new players. And I do want to preface, when I say new players, for the most part, I don't mean just new players to your group. This is more geared towards new players who are also new to D&D, new players that are just new to gaming. Because obviously when you have someone who has a varied background in playing D&D and you're bringing them on board, for the most part, you're just worried, I guess, about making sure that you're all on the same page for mechanics and addition, but also making sure that there's a party dynamic and the players themselves are fine. What I mainly want to focus on is some etiquette that I have found that helps me bring in people who are not as familiar with the game as a whole, and kind of how to introduce them to the game as well as onboard them into the group. And these are things that, like I said, I have learned a bit the hard way, doing them the wrong way myself. And some of these I've learned from being a player and trying to get into new gaming groups that are doing different tabletops or are doing different editions, or just, especially when I was new to D&D and Discord and other virtual like desktops like Roll20. Being a new player in those environments, I ran into a lot of these. I ran into a lot of these situations the most when I was trying to learn a new platform. So at the time, I was considering myself a veteran D&D player because at that point I was, multiple years in and had played multiple editions. So I felt very comfortable going into most gaming groups. But when I was exploring different avenues of gaming, right, there are vastly different cultures beyond just which version of D&D you play and the type of tabletop you play, right? Theater of the mind, whether you have minis, whether everyone fully goes out of their way to role play and dress up and do their characters. There's a lot of different cultures within D&D already, but I wasn't necessarily prepared to see the difference in culture in terms of the medium of play, right? I kind of figured that it would be the same going on Roll20 as it would be in playing in Discord, but even all of those have their own etiquette and their own nuance to them. And I felt as a new player in a lot of these areas, it was most difficult for me feeling like I knew that I belonged here, but not feeling like I was recognized for that. And, as a new player, it's very difficult to not just feel out of place because you're new, but feel out of place and unable to figure out, what is the proper path, towards, getting there and towards getting to the right place. So, So I thought about, all of the lessons that I had learned, and I put together a list of 10 don'ts. We'll go over a little bit of the do's, but I'll probably make my own separate episode of a specific list of like 10 do's. But I've also noticed that I don't like just 10 top 10 lists. Top 10 lists are kind of boring. I think that they're overused. they're good for YouTube content. I even may break this whole episode or this whole live stream down into a top 10, or a 10 don'ts list for a YouTube episode. But I'm thinking for the most part, what I wanted to do with this was also break it down contextually. I didn't want to have a situation where I'm just listing 10 either, unconnected things or repeating myself with saying specific things just in a different way. So I'm, being able to pad out the bill. And I didn't want them to all be just random things that could make you a better DM or could make the process of onboarding that player better. What I wanted to do was make them a little bit more contextual to almost each phase of the onboarding process. And I've kind of broken it down into 5 categories. So each category has 2 don'ts. I haven't really named the categories, but it's more of the way that I see the phases of introducing someone. So initial phases are just telling them about the game, telling them, before they even see it, before they even do anything, it's that initial, elevator pitch aspect. It's the, here's what we do, here's the game, the basic explanation, right? Before you get into rules and anything else like that, it's just the basic way that you would sell it. So we'll talk a little bit about 2 big don'ts for that stage. Next stage is when you're actually starting the setup process, when you're actually bringing them in, when they've actually agreed to come on board. That kind of has 2 different phases. Or I guess, just 2 different categories, but it's those phases of, accepting, them accepting the invite, them coming on board, developing their character, developing, how they're going to fit into the campaign. And the next phase after those, so that would be kind of 2 phases right there, or I guess 1 that's going to have like 4 don'ts. And then we'll have the next 2, which is starting the campaign with them. That'll be another phase of 2 big don'ts to worry about. And then continuing gaming with new players, right? So after the initial gaming session. So 4 or 5 categories, about 2 categories or 2 don'ts each that we're going to cover today. And we'll see where this conversation takes us. And then probably next time I will do my 10 do's, kind of a contrary episode to this one. But I have to step out just real quick, so give me like 30 seconds. I will be right back, guys. Sorry about that. All right, so the don'ts of onboarding new players. And again, just want to preface that with this don'ts list, it's going to be more specific to players that are not as well versed with D&D, right? So it may not be necessarily first time D&D players, but it is going to be more focused on players who are not as experienced and don't have, many gaming groups, under their belt and just haven't had the opportunity to do a lot of gaming. So how you're introducing them to the game, how you're getting their attention, how you're trying to get their acceptance is going to kind of be that first phase, right? You're basically meeting someone, they've maybe played a game or 2. Maybe it's been many, many years since they've played. Maybe they played as they're a kid, or they haven't, they've heard about it. Maybe they've even just played Baldur's Gate, right? So you want to discuss with them, your gaming style, your campaign setting, the gaming group. You're going to do all these things to bring them on, right? You want to get their acceptance. You want them to come over. You want them to game with you. So the first 2 don'ts here, I've kind of compared, or I've kind of compiled these don'ts as well because they play off of each other. So, because they're kind of like the opposite of the same don't coin, if you want, yeah. But first don't in my opinion, or first piece of advice, and for don't, when you are introducing your party, or I mean, when you're introducing this person and you're talking about the people that you game with, the campaign setting, the story, the addition, whatever it is that you're initially discussing with them to get them to get them on board. I've noticed that the first thing people tend to do, and I know that this is kind of almost anything in terms of a fandom. Most of us, when we have someone who seems any at all interested in something that we really are in, that we really like, and we want their buy-in, we tend to overwhelm. And when it comes to D&D, it's not just a fandom, but it is itself an experience. It's a game. It has so many different layers, and people who haven't played, it's really difficult to understand what their expectations might be. So one of the biggest things that I've noticed playing with people, or at least discussing D&D with a lot of people, is they tend to get in this info dump mode and they overwhelm people. And it can be anything from too much lore, just too much information about what's going on, and without it being contextual or understandable. Excuse me. It can be it can be overwhelming in terms of trying to discuss mechanics, like trying to tell people how they're going to build a character or how a gaming session plays out, or trying to tell them and explain to them some scenario that happened in your last gaming session, right? For people who haven't played, who don't understand D&D to that extent, a lot of what we take for granted can be very overwhelming. And this is the thing that I've learned. It happens the most with lore in terms of people introducing their setting, especially if they've built it themselves. And it happens a lot with character building. I think those are the two biggest areas that I see this happen the most in, when people want to talk about the setting that they're in and all of the stories and the lore and stuff. And they're trying to get, the person's buy-in, like trying to entice them almost like a movie trailer. And the other is when they're discussing character builds, right? When people discuss like what you can be and what you can do, I find that this is the area that gets the most overwhelming, and people start to be like, hey, look, I've played Skyrim before, and some people like the whole, character build, but some are like, hey, I've done that before and I'm not really like that interested. Like, some people feel that it's going to be too much of an investment, and you can easily overwhelm their expectations by giving them more information than they were either expecting or willing to get, I guess you could say. And a lot of it also is not, this happens a lot when I think that the DM doesn't see how invested that person already is. Like, someone who is extremely invested out the gate might be able to keep up and might be able to like feed off of all of that. But for most people, when they're dipping their toe in, when they're just first interested in this and they're not exactly sure because they know that it has a big background, they're usually already, I don't want to say timid, but they're usually already not 100% sure what they're going to be getting into. And I feel that there's already so much out there that people feel that there is a lot. I think people know that there's a ton going on with D&D. I think no one's really confused when they hear how much is going on, but I think that's also intimidating. I think that knowing how much history D&D has, knowing how much stuff is out there, I think when people are interested and want to take that step, if they haven't just jumped into the deep end already, they are the kind of person that, you throw 10 books at them and say, have fun, they're probably just never going to do it. But if you, start them slow, if you, ease them into it and figure out, what is it that got their attention in the first place? This will be part of my dues episode. But you find out what what got their attention, and you reel them in from that, versus just hoping that giving them everything, they'll hear something that they like. And I think that's another big issue with the overwhelming like info dump, is there's the other aspect from people who just say, hey, if I just say a bunch of things at you, one of these things will spark your interest. And I've been a little guilty of that one myself, where I will just try to give as many, like bullet points until one of them lands. And I haven't gotten the best reactions from that. And I also haven't been able to get interested as in other people's like campaign settings when, the first introduction of it of, hey, like, what kind of like campaign setting it is. And then the next thing I know, I'm hearing about, the last 19 generations of a particular family and how they completely changed the outcome of an entire race and the kingdom over. And it's just like, whoa, dude, I just wanted to know, like, is it archaic? Is it sci-fi? Is it like, you go for a basic question and then suddenly, you're given an entire novel, and it's like, it's a little too much, and it's almost not, it's almost to the point where it will push people away because they feel like, okay, I just don't have enough energy or time or thought process to memorize all of that or to download all of that before I even begin. And that's where I think that overwhelming aspect comes in a lot, is people just aren't ready to take it all in all at once because there's so much, and they're very aware of that. So having someone who's bringing them into the game be that way, just instantly feel or make them feel like, hey, that there's a lot, so get ready because we got to go through it all. I think that can push people away a lot more than people realize. And again, I think for the most part, most people do not do the overwhelm info dump or just the overwhelming aspect of the introduction on purpose. I think a lot of the times, or for the majority of the times, I would even say it's just excitement, and it's just how we normally discuss D&D. But for people who aren't in that sphere, trying to have that same level of conversation with them, I think tends to scare them off because it makes them feel that, again, it makes them feel almost as if they've come into an episode or, a TV series like season 7 in, and everybody just talks about it at that level, but they just started, right? It can almost be not worth it for everyone, for someone to say, hey, you should watch this TV series. We're on season 7, but you should catch up if you want to talk to us about it, right? That feels way more overwhelming than, hey, we're watching this TV series. You should watch it and talk to us about it, right? Like, there's a different aspect of watching it together, watching it, and being able to catch up slowly, or at least just ingest it and discuss it, versus feeling that if you don't catch up right away and do all that binge watching, you're basically just not going to have that conversation. And I feel like that translates a lot into D&D because, again, everybody's very well aware of how much there is, but they need to be shown that you don't have to have all of that in order to start. But on the same token, so that's don't number one is don't overwhelm. Doesn't necessarily mean info dumping with a lot of info, but don't overwhelm in terms of the complexity and in terms of how much you're making them think that they have to have before they can begin. But on the opposite of that same coin, I would say equally, for the introduction, you don't want to gatekeep. So that is point number 2. You don't want to gatekeep. And what I mean by this is it's basically the exact opposite of info dumping, right? It's the exact opposite of giving them so much that they feel that they're not going to be able to keep up. I've seen DMs go the route of piecemealing everything to the point at which the player doesn't feel like they have any ability to play. So in one respect, you're scaring them away because they feel like they can't get all of that knowledge quick enough, and they don't have the capabilities of obtaining all of that knowledge. But now you're basically making them feel like they can't or aren't allowed to learn how to play at their own pace, or in general how to play. And I've seen this where DMs will gatekeep new players, where it's like, hey, I want to do this, and the DM will be like, okay, so here's how you're going to learn. And they're like, cool, because yeah, I thought about this, and the DM will basically be like, stop, this is how you're going to learn, And it's like, you may want to take a harder stance, or you may want to take control of situations in certain moments. Like, hey, character building, I get it. If they're a brand new player and you're helping them build out the character sheet, you're helping them roll for their stats, I get being there step by step with them, letting them read the book, explaining to them what it is, and making sure they go through it in the right order so everything falls into place. That's one thing. But a player who's interested and coming in and having questions, and you shutting them down or putting them in a position to where it's like, hey, I'm going to give you the information I think you need, and only when I think you need it. That also isn't really fun for a game, because how many times have you played a game that is literally a clone of a million other games you've played, but the tutorial is an hour long and will not. And it's one thing to have a game that just hasn't told you what to do yet, but you can. But I know one of my biggest pet peeves in playing a video game is walking through a tutorial when, if I haven't learned to jump yet, the jump button just doesn't work. That's, to me, a lot more frustrating, because instinctually I'm going to grab the controls, I'm going to start pushing them instinctually just to make sure that my mindset, or what I think of as the correct controls, are there, right? I want to make sure that they're intuitive. What bugs me is when I play games and I press all of the buttons and only 3 of them work. I know the controller's not broken, I know that this game is much more complex, but now I have to spend an hour unlocking every button when I know intuitively that button is going to be the jump button, that's going to be the aim button, that's going to be the fire button. I know it intuitively, but you've made me spend an hour getting to the point to be able to use it and confirm that that's what I can do with it. I'm already past my learning phase, right? I should have learned that super quickly, because when I get to the tutorial and it says, here's how you aim, I can get through it super quick. I don't have to, wait for the text. I don't have to do this. I don't have to do this. I don't have to do that. I don't have to, check all of the boxes just to do the thing I knew instinctually. And I'm not saying, I'm not saying the difference between skipping a tutorial or not, but withholding that ability basically makes it to whereas with me, I would, by this point in the tutorial, have already pushed that button, figured it out, and have it kind of, locked into that muscle memory within the context of the game. It's already a muscle memory to press that button and know it's an aim, but within the context of how the game's going to do it, when, where, and how to do it, would have already been something that I'm practicing before that point. And it's just a way that I prefer to learn. Maybe somebody else wouldn't have done that, but it's still the aspect of taking that option away from the player and forcing them down a very specific way to learn, I think can also be very difficult, because what I've seen a lot of the most in terms of how this gets represented is DMs refusing to answer questions until they think it's time to answer those questions. And I don't mean questions about their personal mechanics or their personal lore or anything, but these will basically be very fundamental, very basic questions. They'll be asking questions about combat or how a spell goes off in combat, but the DM's we'll talk about that later. Right now you need to talk about how money works. And it's well, but that's not where the player's at, right? That's not where the player's mindset's at. They're trying to figure out the game from whatever they understand and whatever they know, and withholding that information and stopping them from learning not only at their pace, but withholding that information and not allowing them to learn it when they're in that moment. That is going to dissuade them from wanting to have more interest in the game, because obviously that's what's interesting to them at that moment. That's what's on their mind. That's where they're focused. Now, again, if you're both in agreement that you're going to do a character build and they start kind of tangenting off, I get the need to kind of pull them back. But again, gatekeeping to the point to where you're controlling how much information they get simply because you don't want them to know it yet, that can be just as damaging as overwhelming them, because now they feel that they're not allowed to learn, or it's going to be that much harder, and then they have to start questioning their time investment. How much longer until I get to learn how to do the things that I want to do? And then you're setting a dangerous precedent that in the future, if they want to know something that's not readily available, are you going to hold that back? Or, when are you going to basically allow things to happen? And again, it can just end up making a very uncomfortable, intense gaming group. And I also don't personally see any benefit in DMs being that gatekeeping. I understand being, gatekeeping information that is specific to like plot points, like, not giving away, major aspects about a campaign or about a storyline. That all makes sense. What I don't understand is gatekeeping knowledge that you have about the general Dungeons and Dragons, about whatever might be in the player's handbook, whatever might be available about a monster in the monster manual. The idea that you're going to hold that information hostage against the player doesn't enrich anything. Withholding information for a plot reason enriches the game, right? It's the whole point of trying to get to that information. But something as basic as asking what level a certain spell is. It's one thing to just be a jerk and say, go look it up yourself. I don't want to, be your encyclopedia. I can understand that mindset. But just flat out not telling people like the basics of it, or, like deciding, you're not going to let them know, like, if they want to know early on, hey, what die would I roll in this situation? And you're going to be like, well, let's wait till you get to that situation. It's like, what is that answer doing for you, right? If it's just simply that you don't know and you don't want to admit that you don't know, then you need to get over that. But if you do, if you know the situation, if you know the answer to a very normal question and you're just withholding it, the only benefit I can imagine the person having outside of just wanting the control and wanting the power is thinking that that is going to lead to the player having a continued curiosity and a reason to stay. Because, hey, if I give them the answer, then why would they stay? And it's like, because you gave them the answer. Like, you're the source of the knowledge. What I don't understand is thinking that withholding that information means that they're going to stick around waiting for it. Because people will only ask so many questions before they realized this is not the place to get my information. When they realize, hey, here's where I can get info, that's where they're going to stay. So be very mindful about what you gatekeep on. I don't mind it when it's, campaign or plot related or personal to your realm or your setting or whatever have you. But when it comes to just rule sets, mechanics, and D&D in general, being a gatekeeper really only harms the community at large, because it's basically not allowing the community to grow, and it's not allowing people more access, which means it's only going to dwindle what we have. And that's really the worst thing that can actually happen to a community like this, right? Is to isolate and diminish just because of a power trip. I don't even know how it's a don't, but I also don't know how many more reasons why you would do this outside of either having a power trip or thinking that this is going to lead to them having more of an interest. Guess I can't keep girl boss. What's up, Bobby Kiss? How's it going, man? But yeah, so first category done in terms of when you have a newer type player and you're trying to introduce them, trying to get their buy-in. Two biggest don'ts, the first two don'ts of the night. Don't overwhelm them, either by info dumping or by complications or by setting them up to think that they have to know too much. But also don't gatekeep. Don't withhold so much that they feel like it's gonna, basically just be a chore to get this information from you or in general, right? You don't want to gatekeep to make it think that information about D&D is scarce or hard to come by. This is a very open community, very knowledgeable community. The knowledge deserves to be shared. So, so second category, next to don'ts for new players, for onboarding new players. Now, this is kind of this category and the next category are kind of all in one. It's basically just the next phases of onboarding. So you've done the introduction, you've got their buy-in, they're interested in coming over and gaming with you and your players and all of that. The initial introduction phase again was like the elevator pitch, very basics to of the game at large and how gaming with you might be, but again, as a very broad, bird's eye view. The next stage of introductions, and once you've gotten their buy-in of like, yeah, that sounds kind of cool. This is like setting the foundation. This next part is setting the foundation of basically like setting the expectations. Like, okay, cool. So now we've talked about D&D. We've talked about like, what tabletop gaming is. So now you're setting the expectations of, hey, so when you show up, this is how we do things. Like, this is the actual like, okay, we've gotten your buy-in to play Dungeons and Dragons. You know what kind of the idea of a tabletop is. Let me tell you what gaming with us is like. And the first don't you want to do in this stage is you don't want to set the wrong expectations. And this can be done in so many different ways. This can be done by understating or overstating aspects of your gameplay, right? I've seen a lot of DMs do this where right up front, when they're talking about how it is and they're like, like letting people know like, oh, you're going to love it. Check, we do this, we do that. A lot of the times you get those over boisterous ones who oversell the RP. And I've had this happen a lot of times where I go into a group and I'm almost intimidated because I'm like, oh, okay, you guys like RP a lot. Like they'll tell me stories. They'll kind of set this grand idea that, this is basically LARPing, but with dice rolls. And then I get there and, the best we're getting is like maybe once in a while a typed out little like sentence and quotes, or when we're in combat and the enemy actually hits a character, they'll like get on mic and be like, it hurt. Oh yeah, he got like, and that's what he meant by, the RP, but that would be it, right? Like everybody's monotone. There's no characters. There's no acting out. There's no voices. There's no grandiose descriptions of every little detail of what's going on. Which is what, you could be presented with, right? It's this grand RP, what we do this, we get really into our characters and we do all of these things. And then all you really find out is that, not half-assing it, but what they have going on is not, exactly what you had explained to you. And I think this happens a lot when people, again, are trying to hype it up because they're excited. Someone new's coming in, it's their fandom, it's what they're really interested in. And just like how easy it is to overwhelm in the first stage, it's very easy to hype up those expectations, right? It's very easy to over-exaggerate or at least showcase things that may not be the highlight of gameplay, but you're kind of making it seem like, hey, this is our bread and butter. And again, that can just be really jarring to some players because coming into a game with the wrong expectation, I'm pretty sure all of you can understand how disorienting that can be, especially now that you're in a group with people, either live face-to-face or you're, on a voice call. It's a whole new dynamic when suddenly you feel out of place because you're not where you thought you would be. And on the other end of that, you can also set the wrong expectations by underselling aspects. So I think the number one thing that I have run into in terms of being undersold is being undersold on the expectations that were going to be on me. So I've gone to gaming groups where they kind of basically say, yeah, we get together, we do this. I kind of let you guys, take care of this stuff like yourself. Like I like he would just, they would basically be like, yeah, I don't like, manage you guys on your character sheets too much. Like, it's kind of an honor system thing. And I was like, cool. And they're like, yeah, so it's like, well, we'll bring you in. We'll kind of figure out how your character fits in with everybody, blah, blah, blah. And then, we can make sure that it works for everything. And when we came back to like again, the unsaid expectation was build your own character and we'll fit it in. So I did. But when I came into the gaming group, there was suddenly a bunch of like things wrong and not compatible with the way that I built my character because of some very offhanded comments, like very like, non-direct things that were said in previous conversations about the setting and the lore and what we were playing in terms of what I was and wasn't allowed to choose. And that was really like, not only was it really like, jarring for the first gaming session because we kind of had to revamp an entire character, but for me, it suddenly felt as if the game I was ready to play can now not be played. And then not just because I built a character that I couldn't play, but the reasons why I wasn't able to use that character, whether it was, the, limitations on magic or limitations on skill sets from backgrounds, things like that just changed the way I approach a character and changed the way I approach, being and managing that character. And so it's just really difficult for me to go into a game with those expectations, either set high or not set at all, and then get in there and realize that there are going to be complications or I'm just not feeling like I'm at the right place. But when it comes to, not setting enough expectations, I think the biggest thing is I've run into it the most, DMs just not having players understand what's expected of them in terms of knowledge base, in terms of what's expected of them to, for them to know and how to act. I see this a lot in expectation of like, how to do things on your turn, right? There's a lot of DMs who will just kind of like gloss over how they play the game, but then when they get in there, they get super butthurt or mad if there's not a certain flow or a certain, like process of things of like, hey, what do you do when you're not supposed to do that? Like that, we don't do dialogue right now. We do this right now. And it's like, well, I don't know that, right? Like you've never sat down and say, hey, we do things different. And that I think can come across as just, I forget I'm blanking on the word, but it comes across as, it's very frustrating for new players because now all of a sudden they feel that it's almost a, like a personalized club, right? Like, I don't want to say a boys only club, but that's just like the first thing that came into my mind. But the idea of like, oh, hey, you don't understand. So until you're in the know, you're kind of the odd one out. And that's never a good thing to have for a good, for a new player. Again, the only way I can think of this is either you really don't want new players or you think somehow that doing that is going to make them try harder. But I don't think alienating them and making them, not really understand what's going to be expected of them and not understand, what they really need to bring to the table. I think that's going to just really ruin their desire to want to come to the, go to your gaming sessions. I mean, it may not even be that you're asking for a lot, but if you don't set those expectations up ahead of time and, it comes out into a situation of, well, you should have known better, but how are they supposed to know better, right? And those can just be frustrating and those can cause a lot of rifts because, again, people, especially with D&D, because it's so multifaceted and so layered, if people have a certain expectation, that expectation goes through so many aspects and so many layers of D&D that when it's broken, there's so many other things that are affected by that perception that now they have to start questioning like how much more is out of phase with what they were, what they were thinking. So I think it's under discussed how setting the right expectations can really lead to a really fantastic or a really terrible gaming session or just a gaming party. And making sure that new players have those correct expectations, making sure that they're not coming into something that they think is one thing that it isn't because you've overhyped it, but also making sure that they're well prepared, making sure that if you expect them to go out and make a character sheet And because of the campaign setting you're playing in, there's only certain books they're allowed to grab a class from. To me, it is 100% on the DM to make sure that that is stated, right? Like I do not understand the idea that you say, hey, I'm playing in this module or with this campaign setting, so go ahead and make a character. But you expect me to first go out and research that campaign setting to find out it has certain class limitations and certain magic limitations to then build a character based off of only certain resource books, because there's another book that specifically states, here's the list of resource books you can build a character off of, right? Like, to expect a new player to know all of that, not just a new player to your, to D&D, but even expecting just a new player that has played D&D for a long time, expecting them to do all of those steps to join your gaming group without any preamble, I just think is ridiculous, right? Like, I would never, if I brought in a new player, especially in the landscape now, right? Especially with the way that D&D is now. If I brought in a new player, I would never expect them to be prepared and be knowledgeable of second edition rules. Like, absolutely not. For pretty much my aspect, I treat every new player, regardless of, if they're brand new to D&D or if they've been playing 5e for a while, I don't really force any expectation on them in terms of the gaming mechanics. I let them explore them naturally and through the game, because, we've talked about it. Second edition is a lot different than fifth edition, and the way that I use it's a lot different. And I don't really understand why I would expect someone to go find an outdated book, even though it's, accessible knowledge. But why? Why would I do that? I would much rather, have them be interested in the game as a whole and let me educate them, instead of just being like, well, you can go figure out second edition whenever you want to go read the book, or just hand them the book back here. If you want to know something, read it. But I don't understand that kind of expectation setting. I really think that if you are theater of the mind, a gaming group, that expectation should be set right out the gate. You know what I mean? If you are a role play heavy group who people like to dress up, not saying that you expect people to dress up, but if you have the vast majority of your players dress up and really get into character, that should be expressed outright. But if you really have people who are good at asking questions and talking to NPCs, but they don't use voices and they don't really get into character, they're just really heavy in the diplomacy aspect. Don't overhype the roleplay. Don't say that, oh yeah, we basically lived this game, right? Like, set the right expectations, and just don't set the wrong expectations. Don't overhype it, and just don't leave anything out as well. And I've already kind of danced around this other part of this, but again, in this same vein, when you are bringing them on board and you're starting to give them this information, this one also kind of happens a lot during this phase, especially when you have the one side I was talking about where you're not setting the expectations properly, where you're not giving enough expectations. This one also tends to roll with that one as well, where a lot of I've seen DMs and players inadvertently, and I don't think a lot of the time it's malice. I've seen it happen maliciously, and usually that's just usually it's just outright. It's very obvious it's malice. It's usually just from someone who thinks that they're better than everybody else. But for the most part, this don't is more one that I've seen happen inadvertently. And it goes hand in hand with the idea that you have expectations that you're not setting. You expect them to know what book to use or how to build a character or whatnot. And it's the don't belittle the new characters. And again, we all know what like belittling someone would be, like outright, like, oh, what, you've never heard of that before, or you don't know what that is. Those are things that can typically be more outright, where you're just flat out letting them know that you don't think highly because they do or don't know something. But I've seen this happen a lot inadvertently as well, because again, people just don't think about it. But something as little as someone not knowing what die to roll, or how certain modifiers add up to things. There's so many times where people will make comments or act a certain way when someone's still picking up on these things. And it's very easy for people, again, to to take their time with learning aspects. And I've noticed that people will, like other players, but a lot of times the DMs will end up belittling the new people if they're not picking it up quick enough, or again, if it's something that to them is so easy and so obvious. Like, let's say you have a new player and they're told you can move 30 feet, but you're using a grid board, and they say, well, how many squares is that? I've seen that question so many times, right? Not everybody instinctually knows the 5x5 square, right? Totally understandable. This is one of those easy expectations that you can go unmissed. Saying that you use you use minis, but not expressing whether you use the grid, a grid, a hexagrid, whatever, like just little things like that. But having a DM belittle the character or belittle the player, and again, sometimes it's not malice, right? Sometimes it's just represented in a way of authority, but it can belittle them by saying, well, you can move 30 feet and each square is 5 feet, so how many is that? Like, that's belittling. When even if you're not thinking that you're trying to be mean and you just think that you're trying to explain it, that right there can be belittling if, you're basically treating them like a child, right? And those are those times where it's like a lot, for players and DMs alike, the longer you've played, the harder it is to remember what it was like to be brand new, what it was like to not know all of these rules, what it was like to not have a lot of this stuff as second nature, or at least just as part of our normal, gaming concepts. I know console players can understand this, where there's a certain intuitiveness to controllers, right? There's certain things that are just always going to be. If you play first person shooters, 9 times out of 10, if you hold a controller, you're just going to instinctually know what aim, what shoot is, what movement is, what duck is, what jump is. There, with minor tweaks here and there, you're pretty much going to know exactly what to do. Someone could just hand you a controller and say this is an FPS, and guaranteed you're going to find the 90% of the controls almost instantaneously. And that's, I think, something that we take for granted, because how easy is it to take someone who's never played a console game, who's always been on computer, and they literally ask, like, what would this be, right? Like, I've done that, where you take someone who's only ever played PC games on keyboard and mouse, you give them a controller and an FPS, and they'll ask you what button is aim. And it sounds ridiculous to anybody who's played enough FPS on a controller. You instinctually know where that should be. Your button, your finger is already probably pressing it in the air. You're just like, yeah, I know exactly where that is. But that's the problem, is it's very easy to make that person feel uncomfortable. It's very easy to belittle them with comments like, what, you don't know, or isn't it obvious, or, there's no other place it could have been. Things like that. It's again, it's pushing them into that, that zone of, I didn't realize I needed to have all of this knowledge in order to learn it. Right. It's in the same vein, in my opinion, of, what am I thinking? It's in the same vein of a job asking for multiple years of experience for an entry-level position. Like asking a brand new person to the workforce for experience that they couldn't possibly have already had. And when you do those things, when you don't only set the wrong expectations, but when your responses belittle them, it makes that uphill battle just all of that much more steeper, because now what's their incentive to ask more questions, or to try to do things, right? Their incentive is to basically be belittled more, and realize that there's much more that they need to learn on their own, so they can play with people who already know all of that information but won't tell them. It's not a good thing, and I don't suggest doing it. And again, it's not so much don't do it maliciously, because I don't necessarily believe the vast majority of people do that maliciously, but it's also just being very aware of how easy it can be to belittle someone because you think what they don't know is obvious. And that right there, if you think something is obvious that someone doesn't know, if that's your first reaction is that should be obvious, maybe that's a moment for pause, take a step back, remember it's new for them, and try not to let that reaction, that knee-jerk reaction of it should be obvious, come out, because that could just hinder their progress instead of being, encouraging and welcoming. So I did say that these next two parts were going to be kind of combined. So in the first stage, we had the, just kind of getting their buy-in. This is this stage that we just talked about, setting the wrong expectations and belittling. This is more of when you are, again, this is basically the expectations phase. The second part of this, it's kind of like expectations B, I guess. It's not, I don't really have like a good other aspect of this, but this is still like, I guess this would be during the setup phase. So, you have the introductions to get the buy-in, you have the expectations phase. So this, I guess, would be the development phase, the setup phase, building their character out, introducing them to the party, getting them, introduced into the campaign, first gaming session, maybe session 0 and first gaming session, right? So before they got to gaming, telling them about what to expect when they show up. Now we're talking about when they show up, right? And the two don'ts I want to talk about here for when they show up. This kind of goes, again, this is very closely related to the last two things we talked about. But when they show up, when it's your session 0 or session 1, one of the things that I've seen a lot happen, and I have done this myself, so I have learned my own lessons, but it's again very similar to the last discussions of, it's not so much malice as it is not paying attention. But the next don't, when you first get them to start playing and you're on your initial setup sessions, is don't confuse them. Now, this ties into previous ones, like don't overwhelm them and things like that. But when it comes to confusing people, like let's say you're on session 0, you're helping them build their character out, right? You've already sold them on the game, they're here. You've already given them the expectations of how what the gaming session is going to be like. They're here. You're building the character out. You're getting the backstories done. And they're like, hey, I thought about being a druid. And you suddenly let them know there's like 17 different types of druids that would be perfect for this gaming session. And there's like 9 different very specific reasons why. That's overcomplicating what they're trying to do because they're brand new. They don't understand the impact of 90% of the choices that they're going to make. I think the number one culprit that I see for the confusing part, I don't find this too much over in the overwhelming part, but this comes down to when people are building their character for the first time. One of the things I see the most about the confusion is DMs and other players. Excuse me. Is seeing DMs and other players force the end game build, like I guess the reverse build of a character, right? So when they have someone come in and want to build a character, they start to discuss with them, well, before you decide what you're going to get at level 2 and 3, what you really need to do is look at level 15, right? Because at level 15, you're going to be able to do X, Y, or Z. And you don't want to not be able to do that. So you want to be careful because if you choose certain things at sixth level, you're not going to be able to do that. But in order to do that, you have to make sure you pick the right thing. Like, that is so confusing to a new player. Like, we all understand that if you want to min-max and if you want a certain endgame build, we understand that, yeah, you basically build the character that you want and then you figure out what you need per level to get there. But for a brand new player, they don't even know what leveling up really feels like or what it is, right? So to tell them to basically reverse build something, especially if you consider for new players, the vast majority of their experience is linear leveling, right? Video games and things like that, where you build a character from the ground up. And not every gaming group does that. I've played in a lot of gaming groups who they all build the end game party, and then they all start at level 1 from that. And by the way, side tangent, that's a phenomenal way. If you're ever looking for a unique way to do a session 0, that's a really cool way that I have been a part of. You sit everybody down at session 0, and you basically have them all make level 20 characters with very rich backstories and very, extreme powers, and basically just give them everything that level 20s would have, basically all the way up to almost nearly all of their gear as well. And then what you do is you basically have them all reverse build them. So at level 20, here's all the things that you would get. And then you step it back every level and make sure that they know how they would have gotten there. What feats they would have chosen at what levels, what things they would have had to get. And then you have them backtrack it all the way to level 1, and then you start the campaign there. And then you have a clear path. Every time level up happens, you already know what's going to happen. No one has any questions. It basically happens instantaneously. You already have all your stuff. It's a cool concept because, again, everybody's started from the end, and they're basically just waiting to get there together, right? And it's kind of cool because as you reverse build them, you're also intertwining everybody, right? You're choosing the feats from the very beginning, that were all the way at the end, so you guys are always synergistic from the very end. Tangent done, but cool concept. But yeah, we all understand how to do shit like that, right? We all understand how we can look at a player or a character and how it's going to evolve and how it's going to change. But a new player is going to look at this from the point of view of, well, I think this thing sounds cool, so I want to start it, right? They're testing the waters. And whether that means that they're going to get something right out the gate that's perfect and fun for them, that no one really knows that, right? I mean, it's one thing to ask them, hey, do you want to be an archer? Do you want to be a magic user? Do you want to hold a sword and be right up in people's faces? It's one thing to help guide them and lead them, but you don't want to confuse them and be like, oh, cool, you like swords? Well, man, if you do this particular build, you get 2 swords and then 5 attacks, and then you get to be a sword master, and then you get to do this with like you suddenly bombard them and make the little thing that they thought was cool into something that's like, oh, man, how long is it going to take me to do that again? And it's like, again, it's very confusing when you don't really even understand the tangibility of how long it's going to take to get there, what it's going to be like when I get there, and what it's going to be like, all the way through, right? Everything before that. And so, yes, confusing new players, I think, is very easy to do when it comes to explaining mechanics, when it comes to explaining character builds. I think character builds is the number one. Like I said before, it's the number one culprit in this particular don't. Because I think people just they get so enthusiastic, they try to help someone build a dope, awesome character that has all these cool aspects and they're going to really love playing and doing all of this stuff with. But in the end, I think what ends up happening is the person doesn't feel very excited because it feels complicated. It feels confusing. It feels... it's almost like they don't really understand what was being handed to them and what was being built, because again, they just don't have those foundations. So moving on to the second don't, when doing the setup phase for a new player. This one is more rare. I will say that this one may be the rarest don't I've seen on my entire list. This might be the one that I've seen the least, but it is big enough. I've seen it happen enough, and it usually happens early on in the setup phase. But again, it's rare, but it's one of the things that just outright makes absolutely zero sense, and doesn't do anybody any good. But I have seen it happen, which is don't lie to the new players. Just about anything, right? It doesn't do anyone any good. I don't even care if it's in a prank. I don't care if you're just trying to prank them, and lie about a spell effect or something like that. It's just D&D is there's already so much to take in. There's so much to remember. There's already so much, I don't want to call it controversy, but there's already so much back and forth with rules as written, homebrew, specific over general, interpretation, that adding any more divisiveness into that already big mix of crap, I think does no one any good, and it only sets the player up for potential failure. And again, just sets them up in a wrong way, because that is now things that they felt confident in. Now they have to start questioning. No one ever really likes that. And, lying to a player in terms of how a mechanic works, in terms of how a level up is going to work, telling players that you give out XP, but you actually benchmark, telling players that, like spells work a certain way, and then you might have a segment, like I have segment based spells, but you may just have initiative slot based spells. You may say spells always go off instantaneously, but then you may not actually have that rule in practice. There's a lot of ways that you can misrepresent things, but downright telling them information that just either isn't true or is easily misinterpreted, and you don't go out of your way to do the clarification. Those, I think, are it just does no one any good. It doesn't do the player any good. It doesn't do the gaming group any good. And a lot of the times it may be done to simplify something, or it may be done to, hand wave and just look and just, just try to pass over something really easily. But in the end, just, it's worth taking the time than it is to set the wrong expectation and to set a false expectation. To set false information out there is just not worth the cleanup. It's much better to just handle it up front and deal with whatever the player needs to deal with, whatever question they have, whatever it is. Or again, even if it's something where you think, hey, you think that you care about this right now, and I know that you won't, but because you're new, you think you care about it, so I'm just going to tell you what you want to hear now, and then we'll deal with it later, because by that time you won't care. That's also not fair. It's not fair to take that choice away from another person, and especially a player that you should respect and want their buy-in, but for all of the right reasons. You shouldn't get their buy-in under any kind of false pretenses. So don't lie to the players. All right. So after not lying to the players, don't confuse players, don't lie to the players during their setup process, right? And again, these aren't necessarily like the only times these don'ts should be handled. It's just more or less, these are the times that I see these that happen the most. So I'm using those as the example. But again, all of these happen at all stages. So after we get into the setup phase, now you've had your session 0, maybe your session 1, you've introduced them to the party. Now you're gaming with them. Now you're full-fledged into a gaming session. Maybe it's session 1, maybe it's session 2. You're full-fledged. Everything's going. Everything's been built. You're gaming. Here are the two biggest don'ts for the gaming session, or just at any given point, right? The introduction, when you first bring them into, introduce the players, IRL or whatever. But basically, this is more or less kind of focused on when you're actually in gaming sessions and you're actually starting into that process. The two biggest don'ts here are kind of, again, opposites of the same coin, right? So the first don't, when you're gaming with new players, is don't ignore them. This is one of the worst things, I think, that can be done once gaming starts for new players, is to be ignored, right? It typically happens the most when DMs have a lot of veteran players or a gaming group that they've been gaming with a lot, and they have players that they tend to highlight a lot and focus on. and they'll let them, run the dialogues. They'll let them run the narratives. They'll be asking the NPCs all of the questions. They'll be getting all of the meta conversations happening. Basically, the only time I've seen this happen so many times where the only time the new player really gets asked or involved is when it's like their turn in combat. And then outside of that, they basically just are just there. And the number one, hands down, the number one excuse I get from DMs, because I've called every DM out I play with. I call them out on this because it is one of my biggest pet peeves as a DM, is to ignore a new player. And the number one excuse I get, or the number one reason, the number one comment I get back from the DMs, whenever I call them out on ignoring a new player, is, well, they need to speak up. They need to learn, like, this gaming group, like everyone just kind of like, just adds in when they want to add in. So, they got to be, like, basically they put it on the onus of the new player to know when and where it's appropriate for you to interject, right? As if, again, you're supposed to know how this group works and you just know, oh, I have a cool idea, right? And again, every person's different. We all don't have the extrovertedness to just like throw our idea into the ring while people are talking. But again, you also don't want to rock the boat when you're the new person. So it is kind of up to the DM to give them the cues, let them know, hey, this is a collaboration time. That's why you have to ask them, hey, what do you think? Do you have any ideas? What would you do? But when you ignore them, when you just ignore them, and especially if your excuse is, well, they need to just start talking, you are not helping. You are not doing anything. You're being lazy and you're being rude, in my opinion. You're being lazy, you're being rude. And basically what you're saying is, I'm not here to help you. I'm here to, I'm not even here to run, I would say you're here to run the game, but you're not, because you're not even running the game if you're ignoring your players. You're basically there to just play with the people who are making it the easiest for you, that are interacting with you the most. And in my opinion, no, that's not the way to go about it. Every player should get their opportunity. And if there is a player that, even if they're, a player isn't very open, right? If I have a player who isn't very talkative, who doesn't add in all the time, and knowingly so, right? They're just like, hey, I'm not big on all of that. That's totally fine. I will still circle back to them. I will still, quite often, not like every single, like, okay, you've talked, now you have to talk. But just, I know that they don't interject a lot. I know it's not their thing. I know that they may not have ideas all the time, but I still make it a point to go back around and be like, do you got anything for us? Like, cool. And again, it's just ignoring players not only puts them off, right? It not only makes them feel like they're not wanted, but the entire experience for the party is gone, because a lot of the times it's almost as if, so does the party even know that this person is there? Are they just a tool for the party? Like, the narrative suffers, the game suffers, the party suffers. And to be honest, you as a DM suffer, because you're only getting better with a very small group, right? If you're doing this, if you're ignoring players and only playing with the people, like the most talkative of them, you aren't getting much better as a DM, because you're not learning how to incorporate everybody. All you're doing is learning more how to respond to just a certain type of person. So whether that's a hot take or not, I don't know. But that is my take on it. Ignoring players is so damaging to the group, and it's damaging to their potential enjoyment of the game, not just with you, but in the future, right? That sets such a dangerous precedent to be interested and put yourself out there only to basically be ignored and treated as if your presence doesn't actually matter. So yeah, not something I would suggest to do. Don't ignore your players. So we're going to flip that coin. We're going to spin it to the other side, because we do have the opposite side of that coin while you're playing with a new player. And I see this, I think this is more common than ignoring the player. which is don't highlight the player. And what I mean by this is you could also talk about this as don't coddle the player, you don't spotlight the player. Basically, in this respect, don't make it seem like it's everything is what's the term like first timer's luck or whatever kind of thing, where you don't want to set the first couple gaming sessions to where it's all about that player. Now, unless that's kind of your MO, right? Unless it's more of that's how you're doing the backstory and you spend a gaming session or two introducing the new character and giving them kind of a whole thing. That's a separate situation. But what I mean is, like, I've seen this happen where a new player will come on board. It's a gaming group that has been around for a while, and it just seems that suddenly you have this gaming group of veteran players who are all suddenly dumber than the newest guy. Suddenly they're just not as expressive in combat. They're just not really doing anything fancy in combat. But the new guy's given every prompt to do like the killing blow, to do something really awesome and like narrate it out. Having NPCs always approach the new person or talk to the new person or give the new person a preference because of their backstory or something. Like, it's one thing that is legitimately happening. They chose to be a noble and then you go talk to the king, so he uses it. That's one thing. But just to suddenly have NPCs, the NPCs noticed your holy symbol and they have such reverence for your whole, and then it's like, okay, we get it. You're trying to, you're almost going overboard and trying to make them feel welcome. But what is that? That may be fine for the new player. It is going to die off over time, and it's not like they're, most players I don't think are going to feel bad for not being the center of attention after a while. But then the big question comes into, what does that do to your current gaming group, right? And I know that it's probably, they would be used to it. It kind of just happens, but it doesn't do a whole lot for the flow of the storyline if someone new comes in, you kind of just bombard them with all of this focus and give them a bunch of the spotlight of the show right out front. Because again, it sets the wrong kind of the mood as their character is now like the main character, and then you're just gonna like step them back into the background. But again, unless it's like built around how you're introducing the player and the character into the group, it's I don't know. It's one of those things where typically I've seen this where the party suffers or the narrative kind of suffers because it takes so much to deter away from the flow of the campaign in order to highlight that person or to let them stand out more. And it also sometimes can get railroady when you're trying to make them stand out and make either cool things happen for them or make them more important than they really are. I don't know. It's less damaging than ignoring them, but coddling them, giving them I mean, very rarely I would see someone get like extra roles, but giving them like NPCs like worse stats because the new players around also doesn't help, right? So highlighting them / coddling them, right? Making the gaming sessions slightly easier, or the gaming sessions are just the same for everybody else. But let's say, you have a party with a new player and you're into the next combat, half the party's down or in really bad shape. So you let, the new guy fudge his numbers a little bit, or you fudge your numbers on the NPCs to make them slightly weaker so the battle gets won so you don't TPK, right? Like, it's one thing to do the fudging as a DM if you need to, because you also, you don't want to TPK someone on like their first gaming session. But at the same time, it's like, it's another thing to do that consistently throughout the gaming sessions, especially the first couple with that person, in order to really like highlight them or to make them seem better or more stand out than they are. Because again, if it's not obvious that that's what you're doing, it can also make the game suddenly feel different when, that 5th, 6th gaming session in, suddenly they're not hitting the enemies as much as they were, or they're taking a lot more damage than you were previously allowing them to take. it's again dangerous expectations, and it makes the game feel inconsistent and not cohesive. So not as damaging. It's less impactful as ignoring the player. But I also don't think it's good etiquette. I don't necessarily think that you have to really go out of your way. I mean, if you are involving all of the players in the gaming session well and equally, the new player should feel just as welcome as everybody else, right? They shouldn't feel any more or less welcome, I guess is what I'm getting at, right? So don't ignore them, don't highlight them, don't coddle them. It's that whole concept of you've set the expectations. They're in the gaming session now. You want them to feel part of it as if they've always been there, as if they are part of the group. And by highlighting them or ignoring them, you basically set them aside, away from the group, right? In one way or the other. You either put them ahead or behind the group by spotlighting them or by ignoring them. And the unfortunate aspect is you don't want to do either of those. You really want to keep them with the group. You want them to hit the ground running, but stick with the group from that point on. Yeah. So that was the category for, once you've got them gaming, you've got them, you got their buy-in, you've got them introduced to your session, you've got them set up. Now you're gaming with them. Don't ignore, don't spotlight. But now we move into kind of another secondary category. So now this is going to be, past the first gaming session or two, right? So they're still new. They're still kind of feeling their way, right? 3 gaming sessions in, right? The character's been introduced. So they've done, players have been introduced. Session 0. Session 1, characters have been introduced. So now now we're talking about session 2 and beyond, right? And these don'ts are going to revolve around consistency of gameplay and just in general how to make the onboarding process more appeasing now that they've built the character, now that they've put in some investment, right? The player is now invested to some degree. How do we keep them? Excuse me one second. So they're here. How do we keep them invested? How do we keep them going? Well, here are 2 notes. One, this one ties a little bit back to what we said before in the setting the expectations, and during the character setup. But once they're in your gaming session, don't be a free range DM, or don't let the players be too free range. I guess that would be more of it. Don't let the players be too free range. And what I mean by that is, don't just kind of, now that you're here, I helped you character sheet, I've helped you build your character, I've introduced you guys, cool. You like gaming with us, you'll be here again, cool. Now you're on your own. Now you're done. You want to learn something, go get the books. You want to do whatever, you do it in game. Like, basically, once you've set them up and once you've gotten them in, you basically be like, cool, now you're your own player, everything else is on you. I'm just here to run the gaming sessions, right? You basically become a hands-off DM. I say don't do this, especially for new players who aren't, again, like, they're comfortable in continuing to game with you, but that doesn't mean that they are comfortable as a D&D player yet, right? The way that we would all be considered. So they may not have knowledge and understanding and willingness to go out and figure out all of the resources and do all of those things, right? They're still going to look at this may be their only gaming group, and this may be their only resource that they have or that they feel comfortable with. So you and the players, the DMs and the players, need to be more open when these new players are continuing to game with you. They're going to continue to have questions. They're going to continue to have ideas. They're going to continue to have struggles. And keeping them free range in the sense that you expect them to basically self-serve from then on out is, while that is a choice to be made, in my opinion, it's not the best choice, because it doesn't feel very inclusive. A lot of these new players, they want the socializing, they want the bonding experience, right? If this is all about me just learning a game, I might as well go play a video game or an MMO, because I can just go on the wiki, look it all up, and then do everything else without people, right? Like the vast majority of what we do with D&D is social. So in my opinion, having players, like having the expectation on players to do everything themselves once they've been onboarded, is somewhat counterintuitive to wanting them to have desire to stay, long term. Same thing when we talked about early on with the gatekeeping, right? If you're gatekeeping that information, why are they going to want to stick around? They would rather go somewhere that they're going to get the information. It's not going to entice them to stick around in hoping that you'll answer them one day, right? They'll stick around because you're a source of that information. And same thing here. Once they've been onboarded, expecting them to, if they want to change characters, expecting them to be able to do everything from scratch, out the gate, from then on out, is just, in my opinion, not the greatest, because now they feel like they've, basically, okay, cool, you onboarded me, now I'm on my own. I'm basically been abandoned. And, I don't know. I don't know what, I guess I just don't know what more I can say. The idea that once you've gotten them to that certain point, you basically just kind of hands off, I don't care anymore, is not necessarily a long-term benefit. A lot of the times, especially when we talked about before, in terms of interpretation of rules is written specific over general, free range players tend to have a lot of miscommunication, a lot of misunderstandings of the rule sets. And it can have a lot of interesting and sometimes negative effects in terms of player dynamics, because if all the players are free range and not working together, they could be using a variety of different resources. So each of them may have a different perspective on what's really happening, what's being used, how something can work. And that can only just lead to more discourse and more distractions during gameplay, instead of a more cohesive group who are constantly talking and answering and sharing the same information, instead of all of them going out and collaborating on their own information, or not collaborating, but gathering all of their own information and not sharing it, and basically all being on a different page. Hell, not even just on a different page, but from a different book altogether. I mean, it's one thing to be on a different page, but when you're all reading a different book, nothing's gonna, make sense, right? So not having them as free range, don't letting them be free range players, really will prevent you from having a lot of that miscommunication, and allowing them to have a more cohesive understanding as an entire group of players. But let's go ahead and do the same thing that we've been doing. Let's flip that coin to the other side, because the second don't, once you have a new player on board and you've gotten them involved, is you don't want to be a micromanager, right? You've helped them build their character sheet, right? You sold them, you got them on board, you introduced them to the players, you helped them build their character sheet, you helped them get through the first gaming session. You probably walked through them, you probably read their character sheet with them, you probably helped them pick out the dice and all of that. You've done that. Great. You got to let them go after that, right? You got to, unless they're asking you. One of the things that I really I cringe at when I'm playing a game with a new player who hasn't played at all, and you have the DM who's like, okay, cool, you're going to roll damage. That's the D20. It's this one. And then basically hands it to them or points it out, or like, hey, you have to roll that particular dice. It's like, okay, cool. So what is your damage roll? Okay, it's that. Okay, so that means that you have to roll 3 of that. It's like, okay, dude, the guy gets come on, they get it. You don't have to sit there and beat the dead horse. You don't have to micromanage, or I've seen this a lot of the times too, where the DM will sit there and be very specific with them. Like, okay, so you're going to get this for treasure. Okay, so here's where you need to put it on your character sheet, right? Like you need to write that right. So write that right there. Okay. Now we're going to give you this. So now you need to write like guys, I think everyone knows how to write some notes. I think we get it. Especially after the second or third gaming session, bro, back off. I've seen a lot of DMs do this where it's almost like you stick so hard to the fact that they're a new player that you forget that that they're also a player. They are playing the game, that they are actively learning it. And so you take this mindset of, oh, well, you're new. I got to explain it to you. And it's like, maybe wait for the questions, right? Maybe you don't have to explain everything every time, all the time. Maybe once you've gotten the basics and the foundation down, maybe people can guess the rest or work through it. I mean, you're there. You don't want to ignore them. The players are there, but you don't have to be ready to answer the question before they ask it, if that makes sense. And that's where, yeah, you just don't want to be a micromanager. You don't want to, be basically telling them what to do every step of the way, or trying to answer questions that they're not even asking yet, or making assumptions that they don't know something before they have the opportunity to prove whether or not they know it or not, right? Both of these, I think, are just about balancing as a DM on whether, how much involvement you have. I think I'm one of the more lenient DMs. I'm very open to questions. I think that being a resource, especially about the mechanics of a campaign and the setting and everything, is one of my number one jobs as a DM, is to be that resource, which is one of the reasons why I'm doing this. One of the reasons why I'm actually really enjoying D&D discussions, is because that, for me as a DM, is one of my responsibilities, is to be a resource for people who want that knowledge. And being a free range DM would really take away a good resource, which is myself, which I should know the most about what's going on and be able to provide them that knowledge. But at the same time, I need to respect the fact that people will learn at their own pace, and people will have different interests and different ways that they want to learn, and different things that they want to learn at different times. And so having that understanding of, I need to teach them what I know that they need to know, but I also need to be willing to teach them what they want to know. And that, I guess, is this last part. The not being free range, but not being a micromanager, is really just knowing the difference between, or not knowing the difference between, but knowing that balance between teaching them what they need to know and being there for what they want to know. Yeah, I like that. Maybe hopefully that'll be a short or something. I don't know. But yeah, that was the top 10 list right there. Or not top 10. Those were the 10 don'ts of onboarding a new player during all the phases. That's going over them again. So these are kind of all interchangeable, but we'll go over them again real quick. But yes, don't overwhelm the player. Don't gatekeep the player with knowledge. Don't set the wrong expectations. Don't belittle new players. Don't confuse new players when you're giving them information, and don't lie to the new players when you're giving them that information, right? You don't want, all about setting those wrong expectations. Don't lie to them. Don't confuse them. When you're playing with new players and you're finally getting them in the gaming sessions, don't ignore them, but also don't spotlight them. Don't make them the center focus, right? They are just another player. Treat them as such. And then as you continue gaming with them and get them involved, be there for them. Don't make them completely free range. Be there for them to answer questions, but also don't micromanage. Let them kind of let you know what they need from you. And that's it. Those are my 10 don'ts on how to onboard a player, especially if they're new to D&D. Hopefully that was some good information. Hopefully you guys liked my advice. These are just my opinions, of course, and are subject to anybody's interpretation. But hopefully you enjoyed this episode. I think I am going to really enjoy this do's and don'ts series. So I think the next time I am here in the studio by myself, I will do a do's series for the onboarding new players to D&D. But otherwise, I think that's going to be it for me today. Thank you guys so much. Bobakiss, thank you so much for being in chat and keeping me company today. If you guys want to join the community and chat with other players and other viewers just like yourself, or if you want to give me topics that I can talk about on D&D discussions, you can go ahead and join the Discord and give those ideas to me. I'm going to go ahead and pop that link into the chat right now. You can click that link, join the Discord, join our community, give me ideas to talk about on Fridays. And on Mondays, we do a homebrew review at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We do homebrew review on Monday, where I take viewer submitted items, magical items, weapons, classes, subclasses, races, whatever you want, whatever you guys have built, and we review them. We talk about them. We do them fresh, so we haven't read them before, so we'll read them live on stream, discuss how we feel about them, what we know from based on our experiences, what we may or may not change, what we would think could work well, and then at the end we give it like a little 1 out of 10 based on how much we'd be willing to use it in our own setting. It's really fun. It's one of our favorite things to do now. So if you do kind of like that, you can join the Discord and give us more ideas like that. And if you like this episode and want to see more of what we've done, we have all of our episodes, all of our VODs on YouTube right now. So I will go ahead and pop that link. But you can see all of our past live streams on YouTube at Misfit Gamer Studios Live. We have a VOD channel where it has all of the live streams right there. And we will be doing YouTube content here in the near future. I just have to get all of that set up to start doing episodes and doing video editing. But you can hopefully see that here soon. But yes, that is going to be me for today. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Hope you had a fantastic week, and I hope you have a great weekend ahead of you. I will see you back here on Monday at 7 p.m. For D&D Discussions Homebrew Review. Thank you guys so much. I will take care, guys. I will see you on Monday. Cheers.